majorities, right? One example of that is like in Congress, right? Or in the Senate, right? I think a lot of the framers thought that there was a lot of people who would get very used to laws being a certain way, and therefore would have a very strong value from that. And there might be a bunch of people who had very, very transitory and therefore small desire for a change to that law. And that was in their mind sort of a way of saying that there was going to be a big asymmetry in the distribution of valuations, that people would have much stronger valuations for keeping things the same and much weaker valuations for changing them, right? And therefore they didn't want a sort of light majority to change things that people might have a very strong value for keeping that way. And so on things that they thought would be like that, they put in a supermajority, right? And I mean, I think that that's one way you can sort of interpret the Federalist Papers, is that that's what they were trying to say.
Okay. Yeah, that was basically my question.
Yeah.
Like, do you think that...
Now, were they right on that? I don't know. I mean,
did they get it right?
I mean, I think you'd have to look on case-by-case basis, but I think that would be an interesting project, would be to try to like look at what things require and don't require supermajorities and see if there's some asymmetry there in terms of valuations across different contexts. Yeah. So, Eric, what's the main reason, how would you explain intuitively why voting fails to be efficient?
I mean, there's always the problem that like people can lie to, it's just like straight like.
So why isn't it efficient? What's it missing? What information is it missing?
I mean, generally when people vote, it's like a yes/no thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, is your valuation above or below this point? So you can only find out like what percentile of people lie on either side. You can't find out their actual valuations.
Exactly. So people don't say how much they care. They only say whether they feel one way or the other, right? So it only gives us the ordinal information of which alternative is better, not the cardinal information of how much it goes in one direction or the other. And making the right decision requires cardinal information. And this gets much worse with more than two decisions, as we'll talk about on Thursday. But also, if you sort of think about all the problems that you usually hear people complain about in democracy, in some sense they're traceable back to this point. So like one example of that is people complain that there's all these like ads running, and you can sort of like, you know, manipulate the thing by running ads. Well, why are ads so effective? Well, the reason is they don't really affect how almost anyone feels very much, right? They really only affect people who are essentially indifferent. But if you can make people just move to just this side of indifference and just this side of indifference, that makes no difference in terms of the social value. But it makes a huge difference in terms of the election outcome. So there's all this waste on all these stupid ads, right? And there's very little on like actually persuading people to have a different view. Why? Because actually persuading a person to have a different view might change the intensity of people a lot, but it only changes the actual like vote of maybe one person or a couple people, right? And so I think a lot of like the problems with our public discourse come from the fact that democracy is like focusing on flipping a bunch of indifferent people without actually changing people's aggregate feeling about what's going on. Yeah, Eric.
Well, I mean, my interpretation of ads was always that like the main factor for most elections is turnout as opposed to people switching back and forth.
Yeah.
And so if you have very like angry attack ads that like, you know, incite a lot of emotion in people, it makes the people who are on one side who wouldn't be willing to vote more willing to vote because they feel more strongly because of the ad.
Yeah, I think that there's some truth to that. I actually think that it goes slightly the opposite way that you're saying. I think it's mostly about depressing the turnout of the other side by writing negative attacks on their candidates. That's what the research tends to show. But anyways, but it's a similar story. But still, it's this thing of like, you know, you're not really changing much how anyone's feeling. You're just moving them a little bit over some threshold, right? And sort of in the same way that the Spence distortion was the case, that's not really what matters. What really matters is the total amount that everyone feels, right? And this is all focused on just moving people a little bit, right? And so I think, you know, the problem with democracy is it's all based on these like small movements of marginal people, rather than on like how on the average people are really feeling about the thing. And another problem with that shows up in the eminent domain context. So imagine that in the eminent domain context, we, as Daiichi was saying, said, well, look, if 90% of the people in the community vote for this thing, let's approve it. And then imagine that the buyer could propose any offer he wanted to make to the people. Neil, what problem would that create? Imagine that you had some, maybe not 90%, maybe it was 50%, 70%, whatever. Some percent of people had to agree to it. And then the buyer could make whatever offers he wants to the people. And then those 70% could vote to coerce the other people to leave. What would be the problem?
So you're saying it's already decided and the buyer can make any offer?
No. The buyer can make the offer and then people decide. What inefficiency or what manipulation could the buyer do given this? Given that he knows that this is being determined not in the efficient way, but by this threshold rule.
I guess he could cater to this majority, and he could basically make a very bad deal for a few people and a great deal for a lot.
Exactly. And he could actually, on average, be offering way less than people are willing to pay, but just cluster it all in that 70%, right? Or whatever percent, right? And you can do all sorts of inefficient things that way, right? So when people talk about the tyranny of the majority, it's exactly that, right? They're thinking that, when you complain about a populist politician, what are you really complaining about? You're complaining about someone who finds a policy that just 51% of people are like, oh, okay, that's cool, but that completely screws the rest of the population, right? And when people complain about the abuse of minorities, that's what they're talking about. Right? So like all the standard things you think about that's wrong with democracy come from its failure to take into account the intensity of people's preferences. Right? Similarly, if you want a bill to pass, you're going to focus all of its value in just a bare majority of the people, right? And totally screw over the minority. And this is often what happens with what's called gerrymandering, right? Which is that you manipulate things to just get over these thresholds. Now, if you had people instead voting based on like how much they cared, that wouldn't really matter. You couldn't like manipulate things all around like that. But when you have all these thresholds, by just moving around who's in what district in the right way, you can get a bunch of votes and take over the system. Yeah, Neil.
We use this then to justify like lobbying, where we have very few people with more income and people instead with less income, and so these guys broker in more and more political favor to make it so that they don't.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't want to talk too much about that because your problem set's going to have you sort of think about that, and let's just defer that question. But yes, I mean, in principle, you can get inefficient outcomes this way, and you want to incorporate some amount of intensity. Whether lobbying is the right way to do it or not, let's think about that. But okay, so let me just give you a little example of that. So there's this paper by Roland Fryer and Richard Holden. And they looked at, how big of a problem is gerrymandering. So what they did is they said, let's come up with a notion of what it means for a district to be sort of like logical. And what they decided is you want to draw the district in such a way that the average distance between a pair of people in the district is as small as possible. Right? That seems like a natural notion of what it means for the district to sort of be like logical or compact, right? And then he compared that to the districts that actually get created. So here's an example. This is what the districts in Massachusetts look like as written by the what's it called? State legislature, which is controlled by the Democrats. And here's what it looks like. Look at District 4. Here is what it would be computed to be under the Fryer and Holden algorithm. Now, in social choice theory, which we're going to talk a lot about on Thursday, usually things are based on a very static perspective where people have their preferences and then you're trying to figure out what sort of an outcome to get. And you come up with inefficiencies. But some of the biggest inefficiencies actually come from what behavior is induced by the fact that you have these inefficient rules in place. because there's all sorts of manipulations that take advantage of the inefficiencies and make them even worse. Anyway, we'll talk more about that on Thursday, and we'll have a sort of fancy, taping that day. So,
Have you seen the movie Swing Vote?
I have not. What's that about?
It's about this guy who decides a presidential election, and so he gets a bunch of attention. I
Oh,
haven't
really?
actually seen it, but he's like the average Joe, like what you would think that most attack ads are geared towards.
Yeah.
Like just this guy who doesn't really have an opinion and he's going to be swayed by
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, so Winston Churchill once said that the most effective case against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average